righty. Hi, everyone. And thank you for joining me once again to talk to you about Cypress and testing in general. And by the way, you did a great job with the last name pronunciation. I know it's a tough one. Cool. Awesome. Well, again, I'm Amir, Director of Developer Experience here at Cypress. And if you have any questions at the end of this talk, I know we're running a little bit short on time. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My DMs are open. I'll be happy to clarify anything and share any other resources that you might be seeking. So today, our focus to talk about the future of component testing that the Cypress team has been working on. And today is just a brief moment for us to get a preview look at and what we've been up to. We've kind of had some chit chat about this, in the past year or so. And today I'm just excited to show you where things are at and kind of give you an early glimpse of it all. And I think this is actually one of the first times we've been, sharing this level publicly. So you're all some of the first to see this, I think. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And before we jump into the topic of component testing in general, I know there's lots of folks that are joining the web development community and the Vue community at large. So I'm not going to assume everybody immediately knows what Cypress is. So we're just going to take 2 seconds to get everybody on the same level, and then we'll move forward from there. So Cypress, first and foremost, is an application that helps you test your web applications. That is its primary objective. Our goal is to help you effectively test anything that runs in a web browser. And, Cypress has kind of made testing more approachable and accessible to a lot of folks because it provides this visual interactive experience that people have come to love. You get to really see your application under test. You get to see it get mutated, and you get a whole bunch of nifty tooling to better introspect your application and to debug. And so this is kind of how Cypress looks like today. So if you go and download today, this is kind of what you will see. There's a lot to Cypress. We're not going to get into that in this talk, but this is how Cypress looks like and what it does. And why do people even look at Cypress? Why do you even consider it? There's so many testing tools out there. Well, one of the reasons why so many developers have come to adopt Cypress is that it's just frankly easy to get started, especially when you need to use a real browser to test things. The API is very friendly and intuitive, and from an architectural standpoint, it was developed with this concept of resisting flaky tests from the ground up, which is one of the number one problems in the world of testing. And as you just saw, it has this interactive test runner, which it's quite a enjoyable experience actually. And as I mentioned, you get a much better enhanced debugging experience. And one of my favorite is this ability to time travel effectively through your test execution to see the state of your application at every point in time where an action is taken or an assertion is made. And one of the cool parts is that for us, we're not just after providing a testing tool. We're excuse me, we're after providing an entire solution to the problem of testing. And ultimately, to solve that, we have to, not just solve the local developer workflow issues and the challenges there, but to also take this, take a broader holistic look and see how things are, handled in CI pipelines as well, and to help teams scale testing in general. So Cypress is backed by an entire cloud service that helps with, detecting flake and parallelizing your tests. And one of the other things that folks have come to love about Cypress is just has really great docs and a fantastic ecosystem and a great growing community behind it. So this is kind of a bird's eye view, high level view of what Cypress is and what it provides to folks. So with that covered, let's go ahead and jump to the next thing. So when people approach testing, one of the first things they ask is, well, what type of test should I write? And there's all sorts of them. And, to kind of visualize this and for us to talk about this, and I've kind of used this in the past, if some of you might recognize it, but it's a good starting place for a discussion, is that, you can really break apart your application into these three logical layers. You have your UI layer, your client layer, and your service layer, right? The service layer is your API. The client logic layer is where you kind of like that front end business logic is happening, and the UI layer is the UI layer. And these are all the types of tests that we can be writing for our application, right? And this is kind of how, the layers that each of these test types can provide, can cover. So right now, Cypress's bread and butter has been end-to-end testing, and that also somewhat includes integration testing. And this helps you, test effectively all the layers of your application. And if you have to do some mocking, you're writing some integration tests. But today we're just going to focus on component testing. End-to-end testing is where Cypress has started from. It's what most people know Cypress for. But our vision of kind of attacking the testing problem in general is much broader than that. We're looking at the entire testing pyramid, and we're looking at, holistically of how we can improve the testing experience for web developers. So today we're going to look at component tests. Cool. So one thing I like to just point out is that, when I show this is not to say, one type of test is better than the other or anything like that. Every testing type has its use case, has its place, has its time, and your usage of them, it depends on various factors: where you are in the development process, what kind of application you're writing, what are the constraints of your project, the team, the budget, all that good stuff. So a lot goes into actually, your testing strategy. So, just know that every testing type has its time and place. And, component tests help us test things at that granular component level and support component-driven development, which is how we write tests today, applications today. And end-to-end tests, they're there to validate this, full user journey that, folks will go through your application. So it's good to have that, level setting for us there. Now, let's take just get an early look at component testing with Cypress. So, today, component testing is effectively, just so everybody knows, is just testing a component in isolation. And typically the way that's done today with, the status quo tooling is to be mounting your components in an emulated DOM or a virtualized DOM. And this is how that's done. And this is very useful, right? Because it's very easy to get up and running. We get some level of confidence with doing this, but we think we can do better, right? And one of the reasons why we think you can do better is kind of goes back to the cornerstone of, where Cypress started, which is running tests in a real browser. We think this is critical for you to get that maximum level of confidence. And seeing things run and being able to actually visually see them is going to give you a much better development experience, and is really going to enable that component-driven development, because you get to see your components get mutated as you're iterating on tests or your application. So it really brings it all into your development workflow. And overall, once you have this set up, you're going to have a much better debugging experience. And just frankly, having an interactive, testing experience is going to give you much more surface area for debugging opportunities. You get to have access to dev tools and also the other UI and ADMs that Cypress has provided. So we think overall, you're going to have much more confidence, much better time debugging, and an overall better development experience. Now, if you're running things in a real browser, and we're going to get to see that in a little bit. So our approach is exactly as I mentioned. Instead of mounting things to a virtualized DOM, we're going to take a component, process it properly, and mount it into a real browser DOM. Now, many of you have probably written end-to-end tests with Cypress before. Cypress is very popular within the Vue community. So we're just going to go look at some code now, seeing end-to-end tests and component tests side by side, and see what the difference is. So on the left-hand side here, we have a pretty typical end-to-end test. And on the right-hand side, we have what we're calling a component test. On the left-hand side, you really have to take a look at the very first line in that test block, which is us visiting an application, a destination URL, right? Full-on applications live on servers, either it's localhost or some test server somewhere else, right? And for you to access it, you just simply have to visit it. So with Cypress, you use the side.visit command to do that, and this is going to be your entry point into writing your end-to-end tests or your integration tests there. Now, with component tests, there's nothing to visit directly, right? There's no URL for your component. So, in Cypress, the way you would do this, just like you do many other tooling for component tests, is via a mounting command or mounting function. And this is one of the ways that could look like on the right-hand side here. And once you've mounted your component, you can go on your merry way and use the same APIs that you have used with end-to-end testing, but now leverage them for component testing. So this is a very kind of generic look at it. But let's go ahead and look at just a more built out example. So one of the things most of us have probably dealt with when writing web applications is writing login forms and authentication forms, right? So here's just a template of a login form component. Pretty typical stuff. You got a username, you got a password field, and a button to log in, and you got a title up top, just giving the form a title. So this is just kind of our little playground for now. And so how would you go about testing this with Cypress? Well, this is a Vue component, and we need a way to mount Vue components. And so, Cypress is going to be providing, and you're already providing this if you're using the experimental version of component testing in the current releases of Cypress, are libraries for each framework that allows you to mount your components. So we provide one for Cypress for Vue, and that is the package Cypress/Vue. That's going to give you a mounting function, and that's what you're going to use to mount your component. And then you simply have to import your desired component. In this case, it's the login form component here. And then all we have to do is, pass in that component into the mount function, and we're cooking with fire here. So this is just the most simplistic form of it. There can be much more involved in the in the way of mounting components. As components get more complicated, there are other things involved, but this is kind of a bird's eye view of how things will work. Now, we have our component mounted, and as I mentioned before, we can just start writing any old assertion. We can just leverage the same APIs. It's the same API that you've come to know and love with end-to-end testing. And so, the previous example was a pretty straightforward, simple assertion on a page, but you all, of course, want to start playing around with props, right? You want to play with all the permutations of your component. So one thing you might want to do is pass in, some props and then see the effects of it. In this case, we're going to just simply pass in this title prop here, and this is how you would do that. And some of you might notice that this is kind of a familiar API. And the reason for that is because we're actually using Vue test utils underneath the hood for all this. So you can kind of expect the familiar input signature for the Vue mount function. And this is also going to ease your transition from a tool like Vue test utils to component testing with Cypress. Cool. And just to kind of play on this example a little more, we looked at how to kind of pass in some props, but you probably want to do other things, right? So for example, when the user hits the submit button, the login button for that login form, you might want to track of that and make sure that, your internal login function is getting past the right parameters. And we can do that in this example by creating a spy, and we can spy on that login function. The way we do this, we can use Cypress's sci.spy function or command, as I should say, and we can give it a name and we can leverage it like so here. So it's pretty straightforward, and it's definitely straightforward if you use Cypress in the past. Now, the thing is that the reason why I show this is because when you are dealing with component tests, you're kind of dealing with the super controlled environment, right? Where you have to mock things out. And so Cypress has, various commands to help you out with this. You can spy on things like being shown here. You can also stub full on JavaScript objects. If you're dealing with anything on the network layer, you can use the side.intercept command to mock network requests. You could even control things like the clock and time using the side.clock API. So there's actually a good set of commands out there that can help you control your environment and mock things out properly for writing those granular component tests. So with all that said, this is how that UI is going to look like for the next version of Cypress, which is going to have component testing as a first-class citizen. Now, this is a screenshot. Screenshots are cool, but what's even cooler is demoing unreleased software that's under development. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to just bring this on over here, and I'll minimize this for now. And this is how this UI is looking like. So if you used Cypress in the past and you kind of saw that little video earlier, it's a new look. It's a different look. But this now involves with, it allows component testing to be a first-class testing type, as now we're transitioning from, not just supporting end-to-end tests, but other testing types as well. And so in this kind of component testing mode, you not only get to see the command log that you're kind of used to seeing, but also you get quick access to the components within your project. So in this example, we have this one component here, login form, that we've been talking about, and we can just execute that, and it will run exactly how you've kind of seen it run before. And this is kind of how the new look is. It's the same thing that you're used to. You get to see all your aliases, all the actions, all the assertions, everything else, but all of it is now provided for component testing. So this is all, still in flux. The team is working really hard on bringing this out. So this is not the final form, but we're on our way there. But yeah, this is kind of how this will be looking like. So with that said, I'm going to switch back to our presentation here. Cool. Awesome. So one of the things to consider is worthy mentioning is that we didn't get into is the fact that, configuration is also a thing with component testing. With end-to-end tests, you could just simply direct Cypress to any regular old web page. You can just point it at google.com if you wanted to and start executing tests. But with component tests, there's a little bit of upfront work. You do have to have some configuration so we can properly, mount your components. So, if you're using the experimental version of component testing in the current releases of Cypress, you're going to kind of deal with configuration that looks like this. You're going to be, setting some values in your cypress.json file, which is the primary way of configuring Cypress today. And you're also going to be doing some work within your plugins file, which is all that code that runs not on the browser, but on the system level in Node, when running Cypress. So, in this scenario, we got to do a couple things. First, we got that upfront configuration, but we also have to start a dev server so we can, have these components mounted and served. And this is how you would do that today. And there's no reason to kind of get into the nitty-gritty bits of it, but I would like to kind of point out the primary thing here is that Cypress is providing dev server packages for you to utilize, just like we're kind of providing libraries for you to mount the component for your favorite framework. In this case, being Vue. So over here, we have the start dev server function here that you can utilize to configure the dev server for component testing. Now, as I said, this is the way you would do it today in the experimental version. But in the next release of Cypress V10, where we're aiming to bring this all to you all, the configuration of Cypress is moving away from a JSON-based configuration to a JavaScript-based configuration. And this is really going to unify the way you configure Cypress into effectively one file. You'll be able to do exactly the configuration you do within your plugins file today, and also the configuration you do in the JSON format as well. And this is how that's going to look like. So the same thing as before, but in Cypress V10, it's going to look like this, and that's the next release. And this is kind of, providing a unified experience where you can configure everything in one place. And it's also enabling to do programmatic configuration as well. So there's something to point out. Now, making this migration for a lot of folks will be pretty straightforward, and we're going to have a lot of great docs for it. But one of the nice things that we're building out within the new look of Cypress and the new app is this built-in migration helper that's going to guide you step by step and help you transition over everything you need to Cypress 10. Cool. So we're kind of going to the end of the talk now in the short time we have today, but I did want to kind of point out that When adopting and kind of looking at component testing with Cypress, there's some workarounds that you no longer will need. So one of the workarounds we see today for people to kind of enable component testing today in Cypress is essentially loading their components in Storybook and visiting their Storybook page within Cypress itself as a way of kind of loading components within Cypress to use the same, the Cypress API and the Cypress experience to write their tests. With Cypress component testing, you're not going to need to do that extra step anymore if that's your only use case for Storybook. You can kind of just cut that middle layer and just mount your components directly into Cypress using Cypress APIs. And the same goes for another method that we've seen out there where people create these, what we call like test harness pages, which are effectively pages that people create and load their own components in, and then they just visit that page. And this is another pattern we've seen. And, with the new APIs and this component testing powers, you no longer need to do that or maintain that yourself anymore as well. So one last thing to mention here with regards to component testing, and I think this is really important, is visual testing, right? A lot of folks, when they do write component tests, they're a lot of times testing the visual aspects of it, or especially if you're working on a design system. And so I think implementing, visual testing is really important, and it's part of like a comprehensive testing strategy. And it's going to be that thing that's going to give you additional confidence on top of your functional and logical tests. And to help you out with there, we actually have a full guide on visual testing today. There are myriad of ways to go about doing this. There are open source solutions and plugins for Cypress that help you out with this, but there are also several services that can also help. Some being Applitools, Percy, Hapo, and they all have plugins for Cypress that you can leverage for doing visual regression testing. One thing I would like to mention here is that visual testing is one of those things that people might think it's pretty simple, but once you get into it, there's actually a lot of nuances there, which is why I actually highly recommend using one of these services if you're able to do so. And they all make it fairly simple with Cypress as they have plugins. So with all that said, I think this combination of mounting your components directly into Cypress for testing and adding the layer of visual regression testing is going to give you a solid validation of your components. And to kind of cap things off, these are kind of the things I think we should all be looking forward to in Cypress v10, with component testing as this first class citizen and part of the holistic experience of Cypress. You're going to get one API, one tool that's going to allow you to write both end-to-end tests, integration tests, component tests. And it's one API to learn. And it's just really going to simplify your workflow. Then the most important part, I think, here is the fact that you get to test your components in a real browser while getting the same Cypress developer experience you've come to know and love, but just with a new look and UI. And another important thing here is just, you're going to get a much better enhanced component-driven development experience. It's really going to bring it all into your iterative workflow like you've never seen before, I think. And the one last thing is the things we just saw, which is it's going to replace all these component testing workarounds of like loading Storybook into Cypress or making these test harness pages just to kind of get access to your components. And so these are a few things to look forward to. There's definitely more to share on this topic. We only had a brief time today to chat, but the team's working really hard on this to bring this out. And we're looking forward to sharing with you more about component testing very soon. So with that said, thank you so much.